Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you're having a nice evening and that you've had a good day. We are at the very end. This is our last meeting, and I'm very happy that you're with me today, but also disappointed that this is the end. We've obviously had such a good semester and such a good set of discussions that it's hard to say goodbye. We've also addressed a lot of really weighty and relevant issues. We're finding ourselves at a point in time where democracy couldn't be any more relevant and the stakes couldn't be any higher. So we've just had such a good and productive semester. It's also been a challenging semester for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, the pandemic has turned the world upside down. And in this course, we were cut short because we didn't have the support we were supposed to have as a result of the pandemic. But I'm really happy that we've stayed with it. And my objective throughout it all has just been to complete the course and, as much as possible, satisfy our objectives. So I think that for the most part that we've done that, but there are some obvious things that we would have had go differently if we had control. Before we get started today, I just want to make some comments about some administrative and housekeeping issues. So first, I've decided to push the deadline for your papers back until Monday because I haven't been able to get everyone feedback yet, and it's obviously relevant and essential. And so I'm very flexible already, and I'm aware that many of us are working under difficult circumstances. So I've been more flexible than ever before this semester, but even so, I'm accepting the papers until Monday. So I'll create a link on CAT courses under assignments for the submission of that paper. But just go there and submit that when you're done. And I look forward to reading it. I will be the one reading it, not the reader. So if that encourages you, or if you feel inspired, great. But I certainly look forward to seeing where you go with your approach to the paper. Now, concerning the extra credit assignment, as a reminder, we don't have a final exam in here because the university didn't create a final exam slot, a time slot for the course. So what we're going to do instead is you have the option of completing an extra credit assignment, which will basically be similar in content to a final exam. And so it'll have concepts, an essay prompt or two, probably one, although I reserve the right to include two because it is technically a final. You'll have a similar approach to the midterm, and this is what you can complete for the extra credit. You'll have a full week to complete it, and the way it'll work is you can potentially get back 20 points, and those points will go towards your long paper grade. So let's say theoretically that you get a 90 on the long paper and you complete the extra credit assignment and you get all 20 points. What I do then is I add that 20 points to your long paper grade. And so you would get 110 out of 100% or 100 points on that long paper. And that would be then a substantial bump up from what you received initially on the paper, even though a 90 is a good grade to start with. So I'll add your extra credit points, however many you get, should you choose to do the extra credit assignment, to your long paper grade. And you'll have 1 week to complete that. So it'll be due a week from Friday, should you choose to do it. And it doesn't need to be completed in a certain amount of time. It just needs to be completed within that week, and you could submit it when you're done. No, it's not timed. It's just up to you to complete should you choose to do it. And if you're a student who wants to spend several hours doing it, you can set aside however much time you want to. But the point of this will be to be able to complete it ideally in an hour and 15 minutes, or maybe an hour and a half at the very most. So I don't intend to overburden you, and I want to give you an opportunity to get points back without really overextending yourself. So are there any comments or questions about this before we continue?
The extra credit will be the same format as the first midterm
Yeah,
we had.
same format.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And it won't be cumulative, so it'll just be on the second half of the course. But the idea is that if you have attended class and completed the readings and completed the assignments, you should be in a good position to do the assignment, the extra credit. So there won't be a study guide for the extra credit assignment, but you should be prepared to complete it within, a reasonable amount of time, assuming that you've been keeping up with the course. Okay, everybody, let's get back into it. As you will recall, we are right in the thick of a discussion about executive institutions and executive powers. And we're really having a debate about presidentialism versus parliamentarism, and thinking about whether presidentialism or parliamentarism are more or less prone to breakdown and backsliding, whether presidential democracies are more democratic than parliamentary democracies, and whether these different types of democracy are fundamentally different in terms of their implications for governability and stability in a democratic society. Remember, that big question is, how do we get democracy to stay intact? How do we get it to survive once we've transitioned to democracy in the first place? And I put it to you, the question, does the congressional majority speak for the people, or does the president speak for the people in a presidential system? And by just a hair, a majority of you said the congressional majority speaks for the people. Many of you said that the president speaks for the people, but there was a lot of agreement that the legislature represents the full spectrum of views in society, in a presidential system where half the votes theoretically are thrown out because of the way that the president is elected on a winner-take-all basis. The legislature might be more representative because of the different viewpoints and the different ideas of the different legislators and how they're elected to represent different districts. I put this question to you because it really gets to the heart of the debate about institutions and about democracy and about the choices the countries have. It is true that in a presidential system, dual democratic legitimacy exists. It is true that independent elections for the executive and the legislature result in a situation where both institutions can claim to be the sort of representative of the people. But it's not true that dual democratic legitimacy doesn't also exist in parliamentary systems. There are situations in parliamentary systems where dual democratic legitimacy exists and where it arises, where there are competing or contending claims to democratic legitimacy. So, for example, does a parliament have two legislative chambers? Do those chambers have relatively even but separated powers? Is there a head of state as well as a prime minister? There is a dual democratic legitimacy between that president or head of state and the prime minister representing the parliament. The point is, there are examples of dual democratic legitimacy in a parliamentary system. And so any claim that a presidential system is by its very nature more likely to break down because of dual legitimacy should also consider the different possible ways that a parliamentary system can break down for similar reasons. And so when we make choices about presidential or parliamentary democracy, it needs to be kept in mind that parliamentary democracy is not free from some of these same limitations. And so let's consider the example of Canada, where the Senate has significant powers over legislation, but cannot exercise a vote of no confidence against the government. There are two legislative chambers in the parliament in Canada, and the Senate both has a role to play as one of those two chambers, as well as significant powers of legislation that nevertheless don't qualify it to exercise a vote of no confidence against the government. So, in other words, there's a separation of contending powers. There is a dual legitimacy or a dual power situation. This is no qualitatively different than the situation in a presidential system where independent election for the executive and the parliament result in dual legitimacy. It's just that in a parliamentary system, we tend to think of much more unity between the prime minister and the parliament because the prime minister is elected or named or appointed by the parliamentary majority. But there are those spaces for dual democratic legitimacy, and they do exist. In these situations, there's just as much potential for breakdown as there would be in a presidential system. Now, it's also the case that Lenz critiqued presidentialism for being rigid or inflexible. So before we continue, I want to incorporate Arturo's question. Arturo says, so like the USA, the Senate may not remove a president unless they are impeached by the House. So impeachment is a political process and is a mechanism that the Senate can use to remove a president in the United States. And in presidential systems, typically, if not virtually always, impeachment is a mechanism that exists. The Congress can remove the president using impeachment. And we'll see in a moment that impeachment has been used on many occasions in Latin America. And so impeachment does help us to understand how presidentialism gets around some of these limitations. Impeachment, though, is one thing that Lenz didn't account for and didn't think that much about. Lenz thought that that dual legitimacy and that separation and that independence precluded any mechanism that could be used to remove the president. But impeachment obviously is an example. And so we'll take a look in a moment at how that plays out in the example of Brazil. Thank you, Arturo. So Lenz also said that presidentialism becomes broken into discontinuous, rigidly determined periods without the possibility of continuous readjustments as political, social, and economic events might require. Basically, what he's saying is, look, you can't throw out the president in response to a crisis that they don't manage well because they're in there for the duration of the term that you elected them for. You're stuck with them, in other words. Lenz thinks that for the most part, because the vote of no confidence doesn't exist as a mechanism, the legislature, the people, the voters are stuck with whoever they elected, regardless of what happens. And so fixed terms, according to Lenz, can lead to rigidity and instability because when you're stuck with something that you don't want, you reject it. And your relationship with it breaks down because you're unhappy and would like to go in a different direction but are unable to. Lenz thought that this would lead to all sorts of breakdowns and that the consequences would be disastrous, especially in developing countries where economic and social and political crises are more common. Latin America was the main region that he had in mind when he thought about this possibility. But Lenz really over-exaggerated the situation and viewed the consequences as far more dramatic as they actually are in reality. And so what we're going to do is we're going to consider the Latin American experience. And we're going to take a look at how Latin American presidential systems have coped with unpopular presidents. And we're going to find out if it's true that presidentialism results in this rigidity and results in being stuck with someone you don't want to be stuck with. So Arturo asked, well, what about impeachment? In the United States, the Senate can impeach the president, or the Senate does impeach the president, I should say, or the Senate votes to convict, more specifically, votes on whether or not to convict if a president has been impeached by the House. Now, impeachment proceedings vary, but those proceedings have been used on many occasions throughout Latin America, where, as we know already, the bulk of presidential systems are located. 19 of the 28 presidential systems in the world are located in Latin America. So in Brazil, Calor de Mello in 1992, Perez in Venezuela in 93, Bucaram in Ecuador in 1997, Lugo in Paraguay in 2012, and Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2016. On all of these occasions, impeachment proceedings were used to remove a president. Now, Lins doesn't account for that possibility. In a world characterized the way Lins sees it, you're stuck with that president until the next election, and only then can you get rid of them if you choose to. But in these cases, impeachment served as a useful way to remove presidents before their term was up. There are also recall elections where citizens or political actors can hold elections to decide whether or not they want to get rid of a president. That took place in Venezuela in 2004. And then sometimes people take it to the streets and they remove presidents through popular outrage and uprisings. Sometimes impeachment or recall is not enough, and popular pressure is the ticket. And so in Peru, Fujimori was run out in 2000. De la Rua was run out at the height of an economic crisis in Argentina in 2001. And Sanchez de Lozada in Bolivia was ran out in 2003 as a result of uprisings that were waged against the neoliberal economic policies that had resulted in the privatization of water, among other things. So all of these examples contradict the expectations of Lins, who says that presidential regimes won't help to resolve those contradictions when there's an unpopular president. Instead, those regimes are stuck with those presidents. Impeachment, recall, elections, and even extra constitutional removals of presidents by protesters all represent ways that presidentialism responds to unpopular presidents who still have a lot of time left before their term is up. Let's watch the example of Brazil, where Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party was removed by Congress through impeachment. And this is a very vivid video because it highlights not just the process of the voting in Congress, but it also highlights the positions of different partisans and citizens in the streets and protesters and people on different sides of the debate. So let's take a look at the way that impeachment works in a presidential democracy. And we'll take a look at whether Lins is correct. Is it true that rigidity prevents political systems from removing unpopular presidents? Or does impeachment represent a potential mechanism for removing those presidents?
A maioria do pessoal de esquerda está contra o impeachment porque está vendo que é golpe. Muita gente não consegue perceber que é golpe. E assim, a direita sabe que é um golpe, eles querem dar esse golpe na gente. E assim, a gente não vai deixar, e se tiver, a gente vai continuar na rua, a gente vai continuar lutando porque não vai ter golpe. Não vai ter golpe! Ai, barulho está no chão, quem quer de uma fora! In your opinion, why should Dilma Rousseff be impeached?
Eu acho que a Dilma deveria sofrer o impeachment por
porque ela várias colocações que ela fez durante a campanha dela, durante todo o primeiro mandato, não está sendo cumprido.
Do you feel that Dilma Rousseff impeachment is going to solve the corruption issues in Brazil?
Eu acho que vai resolver o problema se o povo continuar acompanhando o governo. Porque é algo que acontece de governo para governo. Todos roubam, todos pagam propina. Então tem que começar também com o povo. Parar de pagar propina para conseguir alguma coisa do governo.
A maioria das pessoas querem que o governo mude e quer que haja o impeachment, quem trabalha é quem mais trabalha. E as pessoas, a maioria que quer manter a Dilma no governo, é porque eles recebem benefícios.
Eu não consigo entender por que alguém é contra o impeachment dela, dado que ela está fazendo um péssimo governo. Tem que respeitar a democracia e, se ela sair, vamos juntos negociar um pacto para o país resolver os problemas.
Vamos lá, vai começar a votação!
Que a partir de amanhã, segunda-feira, Deus possa derramar muitas bênçãos sobre o nosso Brasil e sobre o nosso povo brasileiro.
The vote is already happening, and the president's supporters are also gathered today in São Paulo's downtown. So we are heading there to check it out. Por favor, quanto que tá a votação? 33, 10 não. Qual que é a expectativa de vocês?
A nossa é que não vai ter.
Eu acho que nós vamos dizer não ao golpe. Why are you against the impeachment process?
O impeachment está sendo um golpe, porque não tem crime algum para querer tirar o mandato da presidente Dilma. Então, eles, por uma questão de democracia, eles têm que esperar o mandato dela terminar para querer se reeleger e ter um outro governo. A maioria do pessoal de esquerda está contra o impeachment porque está vendo que é golpe. Muita gente consegue perceber que é golpe. E assim, a direita sabe que é um golpe e eles querem dar esse golpe na gente. E assim, a gente não vai deixar, e se tiver, a gente vai continuar na rua, a gente vai continuar lutando porque não vai ter golpe.
Eu acho que o Brasil nunca viveu nada parecido, porque mesmo no tempo da ditadura militar, o que a gente via lá era uma participação pequena das pessoas, a classe média era menor. Então, agora a gente tem uma situação de polarização difícil a ponto de ser perigoso, eu não sei o que vai dar, pode ter uma guerra civil.
Now we're heading back to Paulista Avenue to watch the results.
Eu voto sim! Esse povo preciso!
Today's voting is not the end. If the numbers of representatives against the government is enough, Dilma will be withdrawn from office for 180 days, leaving it to the Vice President Michel Temer. The vote is finally over. The Senate will deliberate. President Dilma Rousseff will be temporarily removed from office. Now the process moves on to its final stage. Meanwhile, Paulista Avenue is celebrating. Como você vai voltar para casa hoje? Com qual sensação?
Aliviado, vendo que o Brasil ainda tem esperança.
Eu volto para casa de pé, com o maior orgulho, de cabeça erguida. E agora para passar, agora que passou no Senado, para passar na Câmara, com certeza vai passar. É um alívio, é um peso. 500 mil quilos saindo das minhas costas, sabendo que eu vou ter pelo menos a possibilidade aí de lutar mais facilmente por um país melhor. Porque agora saiu a Dilma, mas tem muita coisa ainda para fazer. Mas era o mais difícil, era tirar o PT da presidência.
Agora a gente vai ter o momento mais aguardado da noite depois do
So impeachment is a legal mechanism available to lawmakers in a presidential democracy. And Lenz doesn't account for that. He views that rigidity that's characterized by these fixed terms as resulting in this breakdown this gridlock. But impeachment may be one way around that. Interestingly, in Brazil, democracy is in crisis, according to many, in the situation since Rousseff has deteriorated. Her replacement by Michel Temer, a right-wing interim president, didn't really improve Brazilians' views of democracy and the quality of democracy. And Bolsonaro, who's currently in power, also is very divisive and controversial, and has been less than democratic, and has been abusive on many occasions. And so in Brazil, impeachment has been part of the process. And it's clear that Lens didn't fully account for the possibility that presidential regimes would respond to that rigidity in a way that would be productive. So Arturo asks, I'm curious, did she actually commit the crimes? So what was she impeached for? So she was impeached for basically cooking the books to try to conceal the economic numbers, to show that the deficit wasn't as bad as it was. That's my understanding. Or to actually conceal the crimes, the corruption. She wasn't impeached because of the corruption itself, so much as the effort to conceal it. Did she commit the crimes? Look, I don't know if she committed the crimes. What I do know is that the Workers' Party is a very corrupt party. It's a party that is known to have been involved in corrupt schemes. But in all honesty, Brazil is a very corrupt place. More than half of the lawmakers who voted to impeach Dilma Rousseff were themselves being charged with corruption and other crimes. And so, to say that the Workers' Party is corrupt and that Rousseff might have been corrupt, well, that's like saying, well, was she Brazilian? With all due respect to Brazilians, it's a very corrupt place. Parties, institutions of government are very corrupt. And in general, in Brazil, not only is corruption at a high level very commonplace, but there's even a saying that basically relates to everyday corruption, in how ordinary people just kind of do what they have to do to get stuff done. And it's not viewed negatively. It doesn't have a negative connotation. So yeah, it may be that she committed the crimes. It's just that I don't know personally if she did or didn't, because, is it likely also, though, that it was politically motivated, her impeachment? Absolutely, totally. But it's possible that it was politically motivated, and that she might have also cooked the books to conceal the corruption. It's possible that both of those things are true. But the political crisis in Brazil should be understood as partly a result of the division between the left and the right. And the breakdown has really compounded that. And it began before Rousseff, but the impeachment of Rousseff was sort of a flashpoint in the unraveling of relationships in Brazil. And so Brazilian democracy is in crisis. It's just a situation that we don't talk as much about because it's not as bad as some of the other situations in Latin America. Arturo says, so like the Mexican PRI. Yeah, totally. And I think that the difference, though, is that in Brazil, all of the parties and all of the actors have historically been corrupt. The PRI in Mexico was a corrupt party and still is, but it was a party that dominated the country for almost a century. And so it was a single party that became all-encompassing. In Brazil, they have more of a tradition of competitive democratic politics. Right-wing and left-wing parties are corrupt in Brazil.
A maioria do.
The next peril of presidentialism, according to Lens, is winner-take-all rules. And this relates to the simple fact that when you elect a president, you're only electing a single person, right? It may be that the second and third place candidates get large shares of the vote, but it doesn't matter. Only the winner of the vote, of the most votes, wins. And in that regard, there's an inherent winner-take-all sort of feature to the system. And so Lynn says, in a presidential election, whatever the plurality gained, the victorious candidate takes over the whole executive branch, while a leader aspiring to be prime minister whose party gains less than 51% of the seats might be forced to share power with another party. The control of the executive in presidential systems is in principle winner take all. And so, like I said, in a prime ministerial or a parliamentary system, the composition of the cabinet is going to reflect the composition of the coalition. And the very creation or the very appointment of the prime minister will reflect a bargain or a negotiation between the various parties to the legislative majority. That's the only way the prime minister gets appointed or elected, through the sort of formation of a legislative majority. So naturally, that election or appointment of that prime minister will reflect that negotiation between those parties. And then moreover, the cabinet itself will also reflect that negotiation. And so the composition of the cabinet will be diverse, and it will reflect the diversity of the coalition. In a presidential system, by contrast, you're voting for a single candidate, and the victorious candidate takes the whole constituency or the whole executive branch, so to speak. And so in this regard, it's a winner-take-all system. And Lynn says that this winner-take-all nature lends itself to breakdown and conflict, and that democracy cannot be sustained under such winner-take-all rules. Now, there are a number of problems with this argument, and we'll go through them one by one. The claim has been challenged. In the first place, whether democracies have winner-take-all rules really depends more on the electoral system and party system. So presidentialism is predicated upon checks and balances. So even if a president does in fact win with that majority vote and takes the whole executive branch, it still has to contend with the legislature and the courts. In the balance of power, or the checks and balances between those different institutions, should rein in any president, even if they're elected based upon a winner-take-all logic. And then, just as important, coalitions are not uncommon in presidential systems, especially in Latin America, where most presidential systems are located. You actually normally need to create a multi-party coalition to succeed and to enact your legislative agenda if you are a president. And so, with this in mind, the coalitions that you assemble will also influence the composition of your cabinet often, and it will mean that you're not necessarily governing in a unilateral or authoritarian way. It actually means that there's a great deal of negotiation and bargaining that will go into your governing, to the extent that you're only governing in the first place because you have a multi-party coalition supporting you. You need to satisfy those different coalition members. And then fourth, the simple fact that parliamentary systems with disciplined parties and a majority party actually offer even fewer checks on executive power. Think about it. If a single party forms a majority in a parliamentary system and appoints who they want to be prime minister, and assuming that prime minister retains the confidence of that majority, they can rule essentially unilaterally and as an authoritarian. If they lose the support of the legislative majority, there will be a new election, or there will be a potential vote of no confidence, which will trigger new elections, and the members of parliament might lose their seats anyway. And so a parliamentary system actually, from this perspective, provides and concentrates power more decisively than a presidential system. And so we'll look at some examples that help to clarify this. But first, if you don't believe me regarding the composition of cabinets in presidential systems, just take a look at the data for Latin America between 1970 and 2000. Now, these are Latin American countries with presidential systems. That's most Latin American countries, but not all. And what I want you to notice is that virtually all of them have a relatively sizable proportion of their ministers who are not members of the ruling party. That is, not members of the president's party. Why is that significant? Because it means that the president and the president's party are putting members of other parties in the cabinet as part of a coalition deal, as part of a negotiation or a bargain between the different parties in the coalition. If it was true that the president in that party ruled on the basis of a winner-take-all logic, you would see zeros all up and down in every single space in this column. Because winner-take-all logic means that there's no negotiation or bargaining that goes into governing whatsoever. But if there is negotiation or bargaining, that should mean then that the cabinet will reflect a diversity of parties and will show a diverse composition. And that's exactly what we see here. In some countries, it's much higher than in others. So notice, for example, that in Brazil, where there's a very high level of party system fragmentation, the average percentage of nonpartisan members is almost 50%. It's 65% in Ecuador. That means that in Ecuador, if you're a president, only 35% of your cabinet ministers are from your party. 65% of them are from other parties. That's not a winner-take-all situation. You're engaging in significant concessions to even be able to govern at all in that situation. In Peru, it's 40%. In the United States, it's zero. Now, in the US, that would mean then that there is more of a winner-take-all logic because it's zero, which means that between 1970 and 2000, there was not a single nonpartisan cabinet member ever. That means every single cabinet included only members of the ruling party. That's astonishing. Maybe not astonishing if you know US politics. In Venezuela and in Peru, it was also relatively high, 41% and 44% respectively. Overall, the average percentage of nonpartisan ministers in the cabinets of Latin American presidential systems between 1970 and 2000 was about 30%, pretty high. This data is even more telling. If you're not persuaded that coalitions and multi-party coalitions are the norm in presidential systems, and that this counteracts the winner-take-all logic that Linz predicted, take a look at this category right here, this column here. In most of the cases in Latin American countries, presidents were only able to govern with a majority multi-party coalition. That means that they were able to govern, but only through the support of a multi-party coalition, a coalition that included their party and maybe one or two or even more other parties. This means that they had to engage in significant negotiation and bargaining. It means that any winner-take-all logic that might have been sewn into the institutional framework did not really express itself because there was so much negotiation that had to go into actually governing. In most cases, a majority multi-party coalition was the norm. In some cases, the single lowest number, there was a single party majority. Only in these cases was the president able to rule in a sort of winner-take-all, more decisive unilateral way. But this was the single lowest number of cases, this category here, single party majority. Single party minority was relatively more common, but also uncommon. Minority coalitions with multiple parties were the second most common category. But in this case too, it was a multi-party coalition that's being recorded. And so in most cases, far more than half of the cases, multiple parties formed a coalition that was necessary for the president to govern effectively. And on the point of the concentration of power and authority in the hands of a prime minister with the support of a single party legislative majority, the example of Margaret Thatcher from the UK is the most illustrative example. She was so aggressive and so authoritarian in the way that she governed with that support of a single party majority that many of her senior colleagues actually objected to her manner of governing, and some of them even resigned from her cabinet. And so this is an example of how a parliamentary system can actually create the basis for more domineering government than a presidential system. And so Lenz appears to be misguided in his assessment of a lot of these different limitations of presidential systems. The principle of no re-election is common in presidential systems. And the claim that no re-election can be problematic is a correct claim. Few would dispute that cutting off the career of a politician could be harmful to the development of the political system if the politician has important memory and becomes a sort of reservoir, if you will, for knowledge about the functioning of the system. When we talk about political learning and institutional learning, we're talking about how systems create knowledge that can be then stored by the people who use the systems. And political institutions and democratic institutions are examples of the kinds of institutions that could result in political learning. And in a presidential system, non-re-election is relatively common as a system or as a practice. Non-re-election tends to undermine the development of institutional memory or learning. It tends to counteract that process of political learning that can be so important. The principle has good intentions. The point is you want to prevent people from getting into power and staying there forever, and you want there to be turnover. You want to get some new blood in there, and you want to re-enliven institutions so that you don't get this kind of good old boys club where they don't ever have to leave, like the Mitch McConnells of the world. I always am hard on Mitch McConnell, but let's be honest, he's one of the best examples of this this re-election trap, if you will. So the principle has good intentions, but some of the negative implications are overwhelming. And so, for example, popular presidents can be forced to step down if there's no re-election. Why should they have to step down if they're popular just because there's a rule that says there should be no re-election? Maybe change the rule, maybe don't have the rule. It's also the case that no re-election can lead to rushed and ill-designed policies, because suddenly the only policies that are politically feasible are those that can be implemented within a time frame that is relevant for a politician. And if that's 2 or 4 or 6 years, the entire policy agenda will be designed around that relatively arbitrary time frame, and it can result in ill-designed and rushed policies that are ultimately unproductive and can backfire. And then there could be potential conflicts that can arise between current and former presidents because of the limits on re-election and because of power struggles that might result from disagreements between presidents who want to claim responsibility for or take control of some part of an agenda or something. And so the claim is correct, and there is a good reason for it. But the catch is that many presidential systems have made reforms to allow the re-election of the president and to sort of address this limitation and create a basis for more institutional memory and more political learning. And one of those places is Mexico. Now, Mexico has one of the most infamous no re-election term limit laws ever. It goes back to the Mexican Revolution, which itself was waged to remove a dictator who was elected 33 years earlier and who had been removed, and who was eventually removed. Now, he chose to stay in power well beyond his expiration date. He was elected for a single term, and he just never left power. His name was Porfirio Diaz. The Mexican Revolution was intended to remove Diaz and sort of create a momentum for a sort of transition to a constitutional republic, or one that was more supportive of democratic principles than the previous one. And one of the new principles that they put in place was the principle of no re-election. And so for more than a century, almost a century, Mexico had a rule on the books that no politician, no matter the position, could be re-elected. Now, they've softened in recent years. Mexico now allows congressional representatives to be reelected. And they're also debating allowing presidents to be reelected too. But presidents still can't be reelected in Mexico as of this lecture. What happens in the future is sort of unclear. AMLO, who's currently in power, has been pushing to have a referendum that would decide whether he can be reelected and whether the Constitution could be changed to allow for his reelection. Now, it's a controversial question, and it's an issue that many people disagree on. Mexicans aren't sure about whether the Constitution should be changed to allow AMLO to run for another election. There's a lot of agreement that other positions, other elected offices benefit from lifting the no re-election rule, but there's such a strong aversion to these ruling presidents after the experience with Porfirio Diaz that they're skeptical that it can work well for the president too, to lift the no re-election rule. So we'll have to wait and see. But the point that we want to make is that Lins didn't account for the possibility that simple constitutional changes can lift those limits and can get around that initial challenge. Another peril of presidentialism, and one that is a little bit triggering for those of us here in the United States, is the rise of outsiders. The independent election of the president means that you've got ordinary people, voters, citizens, deciding on who that president should be. In a parliamentary system, voters vote for their legislator, but it's the legislative majority who appoints or names or decides on who the head of government will be. That means that in a parliamentary system, there's kind of this like stage in between the voters in the actual anointment of a leader, right? Where the legislators can come in and sort of make sure that, no rash decisions are made about who should lead the country. There is no filter in a presidential system. The voters vote directly, and it's possible that they'll vote for someone who is an outsider. Lins himself said, the personalized character of a presidential election makes possible, especially in the absence of a strong party system, the access to power of outsiders. Outsiders are candidates with little political experience and who may run with new political parties. These outsiders are more likely to get elected in presidential systems because of the principle of independent survival and direct election. The direct election of the president opens up the possibility that voters might directly elect someone who a legislative majority would never, ever, ever appoint. Like, for example, Donald Trump. You might remember that early on, everyone in the Republican Party hated Donald Trump. And even the media on the conservative right-wing side opposed Donald Trump. It was only when he won the support of the base that the party leadership and the media began to fall in line. He was an outsider from the very, very beginning. If the parliamentary system had been in place and not a presidential system, he never would have been elected because those elites within the Republican Party did not support him until they had to because of his popularity with the base. He is an example of an outsider, and our presidential system is an example of how outsiders can get elected because there is no role for the legislative majority in appointing the head of government. Now, these outsiders are often very destructive for democracy because they don't have an allegiance to an established political party. They oftentimes have one office in direct opposition to those parties. And for them, it's about dropping bombs, so to speak, and maybe abusing institutions or generating support through direct opposition to established ways of doing things. That's the nature of being an outsider. Donald Trump is an example of an outsider. And Lenz would say that you got Donald Trump because you have a presidential system where voters vote directly for leaders and where the legislative majority doesn't have a role in selecting the head of government. Had you had a parliamentary system, the legislative majority would have selected someone safer and more favorable or more hospitable to the party establishment. Now, what's interesting is that to this day, Donald Trump still appears to be destroying the Republican Party. There's a good chance that the Republican Party might lose the Georgia runoff because of the fact that Donald Trump has inspired so much doubt and skepticism in the integrity of US elections among Republican voters. And this is an example of how an outsider president starts off with and might always have a limited connection to the sort of party elite and the party insiders in the party establishment. And so party outsiders can be very consequential politically, and they could be more dangerous for democracy more generally. As minority presidents who represent new parties, they're much more prone to wind up in executive legislative conflicts, breakdowns, or confrontations between the legislature and the president, because they don't have the support of a majority party or an established party. They don't have someone to vouch for them, moreover, and they're more likely then to sort of aggressively handle the legislature or address the legislature in a conflictual way. They also have limited experience, and this lack of experience means that they're not socialized in politics. I'll never forget, one of the first things that Mitch McConnell said about Donald Trump was that he was, quote, a neophyte in politics. That was a cute, charitable way of saying, oh, he has no political socialization and no capacity to reach out to parties, let alone the Democratic Party and including his own party. And so treating him as a sort of insider and expecting him to cooperate in these established ways is just too much of a stretch. And then finally, these outsiders are more likely to abuse other institutions. They can abuse the legislature especially, not just because they're minorities and they have a minority party with a limited establishment, but also because their popular support often derives from marginalizing established institutions that have often been discredited by them or by a crisis that preceded them. We talked about the examples of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Fujimori in Peru. And the example of Fujimori in Peru is an especially relevant example because there may be no more iconic example of an outsider because of the limited experience and because of the absence of a party. Now, in the 1980s in Peru, there was a deep economic and socio-political crisis. And Fujimori was an outsider who was elected in the midst of this crisis. There was a deep political crisis because voters had lost faith and confidence in the established parties and were hemorrhaging in supporting non-traditional parties or throwing their support behind individual candidates who didn't have a party. Fujimori was one of those candidates. And in general, they had lost faith in democratic institutions. In 1992, Fujimori carried out a self-coup against the legislature. He dissolved the legislature. He closed the legislature. And in his time in office, he engaged in many abuses against the legislature, the media, the courts, all of which compromised their independence and brought into focus the risks inherent in outsider presidents. Now, for all these reasons, Lenz said that presidentialism is more likely to break down than parliamentarism, and that democracy is more likely to survive in parliamentary regimes. He said that presidentialism contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that generally speaking, you should expect presidential regimes to survive for shorter periods to be more vulnerable to collapse during economic crises, and to especially struggle with periods of succession or transitions from one administration to another. And up until the 1990s, this was the situation in Latin America in particular. Democracy was less stable in presidential systems during this period. But the fact is, this is a spurious correlation. Most parliamentary systems are located in smaller, wealthy states and are, in many cases, former British colonies. And we know that they've often been left with fundamentally different institutions, and institutions that are more conducive to democratic consolidation than the ones left behind by, say, Portugal or Spain, which were much more extractive and much more prone to authoritarian concentrations of power. We also know that Latin American democracies are disproportionately represented among those with presidential systems, and those are countries that were transitioning from military rule. And so it may be too much to expect them to consolidate and to stabilize immediately in the 1990s. Importantly, since the 1990s, democracy has been very stable in presidential regimes, including Latin American countries, with some exceptions. But the picture has improved remarkably, and it can't be said anymore that presidentialism appears to be fundamentally flawed and inconducive or unconducive to consolidation. It may be that European systems, which are disproportionately parliamentary, have existed for longer periods and therefore have stabilized over longer periods and simply appear to be more stable. It could be that in the long term, Latin American countries become equally stable politically, and that presidentialism looks to be just as robust as a parliamentary form of democracy. Now, Africa also provides us some interesting examples. It's not just Latin America that has presidential systems and that can show us or reflect a little bit for us on the difference between parliamentary and presidential democracy and the success of these different types. In Africa, Ghana is an example of a former British colony and a parliamentary system. It's among the few thriving democracies in Africa. So why do I point this out? Well, it is a parliamentary system, but it's also a former British colony. That's important because that means that it was left with institutions and a heritage and a tradition that was likely to support democracy. What's doing the work here? Is it a parliamentary system, or is it the fact that it was a British colony? Well, the simple fact that the non-British colonies in Africa, including the parliamentary regimes, are less successful seems to suggest that there is some role for the colonial legacy of British colonialism. Now, at this point, we need to focus on some of the advantages of presidentialism. What about presidentialism works, and what serves Latin American countries and African countries that have presidential systems well? One of the best advantages of presidentialism is that direct election provides greater choice for voters. I don't know about you, but voting for a president, it's kind of nice, right? You get to cast your vote directly. Now, granted, in the United States, the Electoral College is one step between your vote and the actual anointment of a president. But in theory, the direct election of a president does provide greater choice for voters in the sense that you are given an option, a choice between different candidates who in a parliamentary system might be potential prime ministers, but who would ultimately be selected by the legislative majority, not by you, the voter. Similarly, direct election means that there's electoral accountability. That president has to be more accountable, more responsive to you, especially if they stand to be potentially reelected. But also, the party needs to be more responsive too, because direct election creates the possibility of voters holding that party accountable at the next elections. You can also identify your electoral options relatively easily by distinguishing between different candidates for president. And then finally, there's the advantage of congressional independence in legislative matters. This is important. Think about this for a moment. A parliamentary system really privileges the prime minister because the legislative majority in the parliament anoints that prime minister, but that prime minister then gets to basically rule with a de facto support of that majority, because if they lose that majority, there's a new election which could replace those members of parliament, and it could also replace that prime minister. And so in that regard, the parliament doesn't have as much independence because their support for that prime minister is sort of assumed or sort of is essential if those members of parliament are going to remain in power. But in a presidential system, by contrast, those members of parliament have far more independence in legislative matters. Those members of parliament, those members of Congress can theoretically vote with their party, with or against the president, without triggering new elections or without bringing about a vote of no confidence or a loss of support that could trigger the end of the government and then some consequence for the party. And so if you care at all about the independence of the legislature itself, a presidential system is actually advantageous because it does provide more independence for the legislature. Can anyone else think of any advantages of presidentialism that aren't discussed here?
Well, because of the multiple electoral bodies, which is the president and the legislature, it allows for a sort of forced compromise between the two that leads to more moderating policy, which is useful in comparison to like a parliamentary system where if they get 50% plus one, every single item on the 50 plus 1% majority can get enacted immediately, regardless of how far left or far right it is, like Brexit.
Yeah, so this is a really good point. This is sort of like the other side of Lenz's argument. It's like Lenz says, look, the legislature and the executive are just going to disagree and it's going to break down. But Ishan says, well, why are you assuming they'll disagree? What if they're able to agree and you actually wind up with more compromise and better governance and, you know, a more moderate or a more sort of inclusive policy? Assume that they can function and they can govern. Wouldn't you get a better ultimate result or a more representative result in terms of the policy, in terms of the governance, than you would get in a parliamentary system where, like in the case of Margaret Thatcher, you basically just have this like unitary government that rules from the top down through the prime minister? I think Ishan's point is a good one because he's assuming that, and I think correctly, look, it's a democracy. They can work out their differences and find a way to govern. You know, as long as it's not Ecuador in the 90s or Peru today, there should be some consensus formation or some cooperation that can occur or take place in the legislature between the legislative parties and then between the legislature and the president. And so from this perspective, maybe presidentialism can produce more inclusive and better policy, more moderate and more encompassing policy from the point of view of responding to the widest set of needs or interests in society. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think that there's something to be said about that in countries in like Uruguay or these developing democracies or these consolidating democracies where they have figured it out. They have figured out a way to produce compromise when there's nevertheless divided government. What are some other advantages of presidentialism that are sort of missing here?
I feel like theoretically, like another advantage of presidentialism could be like a better opportunity for compromise within the within people in the nation, because as you can see, like obviously there's like a pretty like well divided split in terms of how people feel about stuff. So obviously there's going to be a lot of disagreements with in terms of like different rules and regulations. And if you were to have a president who is based more in like the center, and whether it be preferably it'd be like between like the center left and center right, but you know, we take what we can get at this point. It would be easier for other branches of the government to help be aided in compromises when it comes to potential legislature, because your main figure is like willing to aid in whatever compromising processes you want.
So involving more institutional actors could be an advantage of presidentialism. When you have a distinction between the executive and the legislature, maybe there's more of a role for the courts, or there's more horizontal accountability between the actors than there would be in, say, a parliamentary system. So that could definitely be an advantage. All of these are potential advantages. And I think that the main point is that Lenz over-exaggerated the limitations. And when he picked up on some of the limits of presidentialism, what he was mainly observing, I think, are some of the problems in Latin American democracies, the military's influence, the weakness of some of the institutions, the enduring cultural ideas in sort of cultural basis for authoritarianism that stems back from the colonial period. A lot of those are things that relate to the Latin American experience that don't have anything to do with presidentialism. And Lenz himself was a Latin American. And so naturally he would be critical of some of those limitations. But I think the problem is that he projected and he characterized presidentialism as flawed when really he was picking out the flaws in Latin American countries. And what's notable is that in those Latin American democracies, some of those democracies have been strengthened, and yet some of those old problems still do persist. So it's possible to have a stronger democracy where the military nevertheless remains influential. So Chile is a good example. Those are Latin American issues, not issues of presidentialism. You know what, before we actually address that, I want to create a poll, because I want to know what you all think. I'm going to create a poll regarding your preference between parliamentarism and presidentialism. All right, everyone, I'm launching a poll. I want to know, if given the choice, would you choose a presidential democracy or a parliamentary democracy? And think about the relationship between those different institutional actors and how power is dispersed differently between them. So as you vote, I'd like to hear from anyone who wants to comment or share their input, either via the chat or the mic. Why did you say either presidentialism or parliamentarism? if given the choice? Or what I should say maybe is, first, what did you put? And then second, why?
So I put presidentialism for, I think it's useful to illustrate this with two examples. If you compare the conservative government in Britain to the presidency of Donald Trump. While people rightfully saw Donald Trump as more of a threat to America or threat to the global environment than the conservative government, the one that's created more lasting damage for their particular country isn't the president, it's the conservative government. By taking them out of the European Union, which parliamentarism allowed them to do because 53% of their citizens voted for it. That creates a significantly longer lasting impact than Trump trying to, for example, overturn the results of the election, which is not nothing, and I don't want to understate the importance of that, but there's no actual policy that came out of a presidentialism because of the limited government and the way that the legislature can sort of check the president, whereas there was no check on the conservative agenda, and England is going to suffer for it for years to come as a result.
That's a good example, Ishan, and it makes me believe that from your perspective, maybe if the UK had had a presidential system, they wouldn't have left the European Union, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, pretty much. It's sort of like if there had been some sort of way, for example, Labor and or the Leave coalition to have a voice in the discussion, they wouldn't have been able to leave or leave in the automatic manner that.
Yeah. And I think that the point is a very good one, which is that, look, when you have this like separation of powers, you create multiple veto points in multiple stages where any decision like that could be prevented. But in the case of the UK and the parliamentary system, in the way in which power is unitary and filters down from the prime minister who relies on the legislative majority, you create that possibility because you take away that division of power and you take away that veto point, so to speak. And I think Ishan's point is very interesting and provocative even, because it makes us think about the impact of different governments and how the institutions either create possibilities or restrict them. I'm going to read one comment and then let you go, okay? Julissa says, I put presidentialism because in a parliamentary system, the top government officials and members of cabinet aren't chosen by voters, and the executive branch gets its power from the legislative branch. So I'd go with a presidential system just because I feel like more people have a voice and the voices of society are heard more as a whole and are taken more into consideration. Not sure if that made sense, but I tried. It totally makes sense, Julissa. And I think that your point that in a presidential system we vote directly for those people and we have a say is a good one, because it connects with Ishan's point about how having that division creates the possibility that there are more actors involved and maybe there's less rush to make those decisions, like say Brexit in the case of the UK. Listen, everybody, we're out of time. And as always, it's difficult to say goodbye, and especially this time, because despite all the difficulties, I loved this class and I learned so much from you. And I wish we could continue to meet, and I wish I could have all of you again. But as always, good things must come to an end. I hope that I have you again next semester, and I hope that I can continue to support you. But thank you so much for always being so engaged, and I just loved coming here. I'll continue to support you, and we're not done yet. Let's continue to finish strong, but I will let you go, and this brings it to an end. So thanks so much, everybody. It's been a wrap.
Thank you again, Professor.
Thanks, Daniela.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Luis.
It doesn't have to be. Basically, because obviously we didn't get the feedback for transitions, most of my immediate focus has gone to that paper. So I've put significantly more time into that paper than the Latin American one. So is there any way I can submit that one by Friday and have the Latin American one be extended to Monday?
Yeah, that's fine. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, these are exceptional circumstances, and my objective is for students to finish and to do their best work. So, yeah, just make sure that you get everything in according to that time frame, and
Yeah,
it's all good.
because I'm gonna have no problems getting the transitions one done by Friday, but the Latin American one would be a bit more difficult.
I mean, if you want to wait and try to get the feedback that I'm going to provide before you submit the transitions paper, it's fine with me, but it's up to you.
Okay, I can do that.
I mean, the main reason I don't have it out just yet, to be honest with you, is that I'm finishing a revision of an article of my own for a journal, and so the due date is tomorrow. And
Oh,
the journal gave me the due date for tomorrow, and it's like, oh, I can't really tell them no, so
mhm.
I just have a lot going on. But
Yeah, no, I feel that. I understand. That's why I was trying to get this one done as quickly as I could because the feedback obviously gives me more of a basis to write the second paper for Latin American politics. I felt like that would make it for me to write the paper around it. But yeah, thank you for allowing me to turn in the papers a bit after the due date
no problem, Ishan.
for such a great semester. Like I told you in office hours, you did a great job.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You were a great student.
All right.
All right, I'll see you around. I'll see you next semester. I can't wait.
Hi, Professor. I just had a couple of final questions about the essay. I'm currently working on it for our class, and we're basically building off of like the previous essay, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, and we're gonna get the feedback by like Friday, so that way we can so that way I can incorporate kind of all that into my essay.
Yeah.
Also, how will the final when will the link be when will the final like submission stuff for the extra credit for the final be open? Well, not the final, but like the extra credit.
Friday.
Friday will also be open, and that will be due on Monday too.
No, so you have a full week.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, I was really scared for a second.
No. So I'll give you plenty of time, and really, honestly, just as long as you get it to me before the semester's over. And but yeah, I plan to give you a full week, and hopefully people have their papers done so they can have some time to devote to the extra credit if they want to do it.
Thank you. Sorry, I have like 2 papers that I have to turn in on Monday, so my mind is a little scrambled right now. But I really appreciate the extension. The fact that you wanted to extend the paper due date from Friday to Monday, that kind of saved my life a little bit.
Good.
And I just wanted to again thank you for the class. It was honestly, I don't know how many times I've told you before, but I really appreciated the course. I found it really interesting, and a lot of the course stuff that we've gone over, and kind of also like now seeing it and like how I've kind of taken this course into like my own personal life, and like now I kind of pay more attention to especially when it comes to like global news, and I know especially Latin America because like my family's from there, and kind of seeing all of their like political discourse makes like a lot more sense now after this course. So
Yeah.
thank you again. I hope to have another course with you sometime soon, Professor.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being a great student, and I really enjoyed having you. And if I can get a reader next semester, you should apply. So just
Of course.
let's be in touch.
That'd be awesome. I would love, that'd be such a cool opportunity, honestly.
I'll see if I can get a line for a reader.
Of course. Have a wonderful semester. Happy holidays. And please rest. You seem like you need it.
Oh gosh. Thank you. I appreciate that. I will.
Of course. Have a wonderful day.
You too.